I've never gotten two consecutive answers that are basically the same thing about what the historical standard is for determining if someone existed or not.
Very good question. Let's get into it.
Yes, I agree. Let's get into it. Although I feel like the historical criteria that I'm going to lay out is going to be at least a little bit different than Dadpool. So while it's not exactly the same as Dadpool's, it's basically the same thing. So there is going to be, again, a lot of agreement between both Captain Dadpool and I on the criteria for proving that some event or person actually existed in history. But there are a few problematic things with Dadpool's criteria and also the way he evaluates his criteria for the historical Jesus. So if you want to fuck around and find out what Dadpool gets wrong about the historical criteria for Jesus, then please stay tuned. What's up, heathens? How y'all doing? I'm the Godless Engineer, and I critically analyze apologist claims to give you the best arguments and information so that you can stand up and use your voice. Again, though, we're not going to be discussing an apologist today. We are discussing fellow atheist and content creator Captain Dadpool. Recently, he was stitched with and responded to somebody asking him on TikTok, what's the criteria for proving that a historical person existed in history? And there are criteria that historians use to establish that something either happened, what happened, or that somebody existed, somebody did a thing. There are criteria that are being used in history to establish those things. But I do have a few points of disagreement with not only Captain Dadpool's list of criteria, but also how he evaluates his criteria for the historical Jesus. Last time, I highlighted a few things that I unequivocally agreed with Captain Dadpool on, and there will be a few of those cases here in this video, so I'm just going to mention those as they come up. Alright, so let's get on into the video.
And just because it's you, I'm breaking out the bat board. So historians do have a wish list. That is a criteria that they would like to see in order to determine what did and did not happen in history. They want multiple sources. The more the merrier.
Yes, I agree. Multiple sources are good, but there's one important word that's missing there. And I think that it's later on in your list, but it really should just be one criteria, not two separate ones. So the actual criteria should be multiple independent sources. Because just saying multiple sources, I mean, you would have to say, oh, the Bible has multiple sources. In the fact that there are multiple copies of it, that could be multiple sources right there. Multiple, different copies of it even. So using the whole multiple sources thing doesn't exactly encapsulate what historians are looking for as far as a wish list of criteria. What they're looking for are multiple independent sources, multiple independent accounts. That word independent is very important when you're talking about sources, especially when it's concerning the Bible. But the criteria of multiple independent sources ensures that we have multiple people that are independently attesting to some event or person actually existing. Multiple independent accounts would allow us to corroborate or to triangulate this person or event in history. We can, figure out where the differences are, which account is more reliable, and all these other things. So multiple independent accounts is what we're looking for here, not just multiple accounts in general. The big problem with just saying multiple accounts in this situation is that you can have multiple accounts, but let's say you have 3 accounts here. You've got one account that is the source account, and then the 2 other accounts are going to copy off of that one account, or they copy off of each other, or both. In that particular situation, you don't have multiple sources corroborating some event or person as existing or happening in history. What you have is one source saying that this thing happened or this person existed, and then other people copying that. And so you don't have multiple accounts there, you just have one. This is going to be very important later.
They'd like them to be written close to the event that they record. Historical accounts tend to become more and more legendary the further away they are being written. There are a million examples of this. So the earlier the source, the less likely it is to contain legend and hearsay.
This is one of those criteria that I definitely do agree with. Now, when Dadpool gets to evaluating these against the historical Jesus, I have some disagreement there. But as far as this being a criteria, this is a good criteria to list for the historical Jesus. So we're approving the historical Jesus. Having the accounts written close to when Jesus supposedly lived is very much a benefit. As we'll see when we get to the evaluation section, they weren't written soon enough.
They would like the sources to be independent from one another, so that there is no collaboration.
Well, again, so this point right here should really be worked into the multiple sources up above, multiple independent sources. So he's really just split one criteria, and that's a minor disagreement, really, because he's still requiring independent sources here. It just needs to be independent in regards to having multiple sources. Just because you have a singular independent source doesn't mean that that indicates that, something existed in history, although that would be really great if we had that. Sadly, though, for the historical Jesus, we don't.
They would like those sources to lack contradiction, obviously.
Lacking in contradiction, not necessarily. I mean, obviously we wouldn't want them to contradict if we're looking to verify, specific details in an event or something like that. But for the purposes of proving that some event happened or some event or some person existed in history, I mean, as far as contradictions go, I don't really see this being all that useful because we have historical accounts that contradict specific details, but on the whole are generally considered to be accurate. So I don't really see how this criteria can help us get to whether or not Jesus existed, other than you're expecting to have some accounts that say that Jesus didn't exist, and then there's other accounts that say that he did. And if you're looking for that, then there are definitely pieces of evidence that we can find in history that seem to indicate that not all Christians believe that Jesus was a historically born person on earth, that he was a celestial figure, that he was only ever a celestial figure. We have multiple instances of that directly in the Bible that showcase this particular thought. So, I mean, if you're looking for contradictions, I mean, I guess it would fail in that. But as far as this is a criteria for proving that somebody existed in history, I really don't see it as useful, but whatever, we'll consider it.
They would like those sources to be internally consistent. They need to all show a basic concern for reality. In other words, are they actually showing concern for the reliability of their accounts?
Yes, internally consistent is very important when considering some account or whatnot, but I disagree with him saying that they have to show a general regard for reality, because we have historical accounts from Herodotus and other people that have fantastical elements within the accounts. But just because they have fantastical elements to it doesn't mean that, they're completely awash. This criteria seems to break for them. Being internally consistent means, I guess something a little bit different than what Dadpool is trying to say here, because it's not about showing regard for reality necessarily. It's just being internally consistent with the author. So, if an author is saying that, Jesus was a flying mammoth, that's not internally consistent, in several respects. Or something of that nature. Being internally consistent, I don't think necessarily requires being consistent with reality in all aspects. So, I mean, just a minor disagreement there. I still like that particular criteria, being internally consistent with, Jewish ideology as far as what they were thinking about the Messiah and everything like that. I think that that's very important for establishing, some facts about Jesus, maybe.
And of course, they have to be unbiased. Now let's compare this with the New Testament.
Oh, awesome. I can't wait. I do agree about the unbiased nature, but I don't think that that's necessarily a requirement for proving that some event or person existed in history, because, somebody can be biased, but we can establish basic facts even with their biased account, which I think that Dadpool would agree with, that just because they're biased, that doesn't mean that we can't use them to historically know something. We just have to scrutinize them a little bit harder. So, like, for instance, on this would be Paul's epistles. And I'll get more into that here in a little bit as far as a historical source, Paul being a historical source. But for Paul, he is biased. He's a biased source. And so we need to highly scrutinize what he's saying and why he's saying it. And that's part of the field of New Testament studies. And so being unbiased would be great, but not necessarily needed to prove that Jesus existed in history.
Remember that the New Testament is not one single book. It is several books that were compiled together much later. So do you have multiple sources? Yes. We have a very abnormal amount of sources for someone who lived 2,000 years ago.
See, this is what I'm saying about having an issue when it comes to evaluating these points of criteria against the historical Jesus, because right off the bat here, we have him saying that we have an abnormal amount of sources for Jesus' existence. But if you carefully consider the sources that we do have, you'll find that it's not really abundant, nor is it abnormal. And remember, the criteria that I'm using here is actually a combination of two of his criteria, multiple independent sources. So we'll cover it a little bit more here in a second when he gets to the independent sources, but for the multiple independent accounts, we don't have that. We have one account. That would be Paul's account. Paul is the only independent source that we have about Jesus existing at all or appearing to people at all. That's the only account that we have. And I'll explain this here in a little bit, like the background information on this to prove it. But basically, the Synoptic Gospels, they knew Paul's work. Mark definitely knew what Paul was saying, what he was laying down, the theology that he was teaching, and also Paul's personal opinions on things. So that means that the Gospel of Mark at least used Paul's work in some kind of sense in order to inform himself on what Jesus might have said or did. And so considering that and the fact that Matthew and Luke both copy off of Mark, with Luke copying off of Matthew too, that means that the three Synoptic Gospels are not independent accounts at all. They're all based on Paul, which resolves us to one independent account. And then John is definitely not independent of the Synoptics, and we'll get into that here in a little bit, like I said. But the Gospel of John definitely uses the Synoptics in order to inform his redactions of those Gospels. So everybody knew Paul's work. Paul was a rock star in the early Christian community. His stuff circulated all throughout the Christian community. So there's no way that they can't be tainted. What we're looking for with multiple independent accounts here would be independent accounts that were written at the same time as Paul was writing or prior to that. But we don't have anybody writing at that time. The closest that we have really is the Hebrews, but that was written by somebody. We don't know who, but it definitely wasn't Paul. So, but they were writing at about the same time as Paul was writing, and not even that book really relates that Jesus physically existed on earth. It has a lot of different connotations in it that imply that Jesus had a God-created or a divinely created body that he inhabited. So, really, we're just stuck with Paul. Paul is the only source that we have, because that's the only independent source that we have. If the other sources are derived off of Paul, then there's no way that we can count those as multiple independent sources. You could count them as multiple sources, but they all resolve to just one account. So I would change my evaluation from a blue check mark to a big red X here, because it obviously doesn't satisfy this. We have one account that's independent of other Christian writings at the time, but not independent of Christian thought. So,
are they written close to the events that they record? The books of the New Testament are written between 20 and 70 years after the death of Jesus. That's not perfectly ideal, but by historical standards, that's not that bad. I'm going to give this one an M for meh.
Now, on the one hand, I do agree with Captain Dadpool here that this is generally good as far as historical sources go, but the problem is that time frame still doesn't allow for most of the sources that we have for Jesus to predate Paul. In order to predate Paul, or to be written contemporaneously with Paul, they would have had to have written within the first 20 years of Jesus' supposed death. After that point, everything else is tainted by Paul. As far as the actual evidence that we have, the empirical evidence that we have in the form of manuscripts and textual evidence in general, everything was tainted by Paul. And so we would need something that isn't tainted by Paul. And the way to ensure that would be to have something written at the same time as Paul or prior to Paul. And we just simply don't have that. So are the Gospels and other writings about Jesus like written close to the time when Jesus supposedly died? Yeah. But when you do further source criticism on those sources and those sources, you'll find that it all ultimately just resolves to Paul's work. And there's nobody else that writes anything about it. And even then, Paul is vague about whether or not Jesus was born or existed on earth in any kind of historical way.
Are they independent sources? How many exactly is fiercely debated among scholars, but the answer is definitely. Paul does not have any knowledge of the Gospels because they were not written yet when he was writing. The Gospels, with the exception of Luke, do not seem to know anything about Paul. The book of John doesn't seem to have any knowledge of the Synoptic Gospels or Paul. So that one's going to get a blue check.
Okay, again, I vehemently disagree with this point. And this should really be lumped in with the first point, but, he's got them in separate points. In any case, the Synoptic Gospels definitely all knew Paul's work in one way or another. John ultimately knew the Synoptic Gospels. So let's kind of break this down to see how we know these things. Let's start with Mark's Gospel and his connection with Paul. In case you want further information on this, or, you're one of those people that loves to read like New Testament scholarship or whatnot, here's a list of the current scholarship that is putting forth the best arguments to show this link between Mark's gospel and Paul's work. So if you want to go and check that out, please do. Now, the case that connects the Gospel of Mark to Paul is cumulative and fairly strong. The way that we know that Paul's work influenced the Gospel of Mark is through several instances in Mark where he obviously had to have gotten this kind of idea from Paul. One of the clearest examples of this is Jesus on taxation. Now, writing prior to the Gospel of Mark, Paul was saying that it was his own opinion that you should pay your taxes. In several instances, whenever he's talking about like a commandment from Jesus or something that Jesus said or Jesus commanded, he explicitly indicates that Jesus did say these things, or that Jesus commanded these things. Like, for instance, 1 Corinthians 9:14, which says, "In the same way, the Lord has commanded that those who preach the gospel should receive their living from the gospel." Let's compare this to Romans 13:5 and 6. "Therefore, it is necessary to submit to the authorities, not only because of the possible punishment, but also as a matter of conscience. This is also why you pay taxes. For the authorities are God's servants, who give their full time to governing." So as we can tell here, this is not a commandment from Jesus, nor is this anything that Jesus has said as far as Paul understands it. This is Paul rationalizing his way into saying that the Christians should submit themselves to the governing authorities because the governing authorities are put there by God, and that this is also the reason why you should pay your taxes. Now, let's fast forward in time to around 70 AD when the Gospel of Mark is being written. Let's go to Mark 12:13 to 17. "Later, they sent some of the Pharisees and Herodians to Jesus to catch him in his words. They came to him and said, 'Teacher, we know that you are a man of integrity. You aren't swayed by others, because you pay no attention to who they are, but you teach the way of God in accordance with the truth. Is it right to pay the imperial tax to Caesar or not? Should we pay or shouldn't we?' But Jesus knew their hypocrisy. 'Why are you trying to trap me?' he asked. 'Bring me a denarius and let me look at it.' They brought the coin, and he asked them, 'Whose image is this, and whose inscription?' 'Caesar's,' they replied. Then Jesus said to them, 'Give back to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's.' And they were amazed at him." So as you can tell, the Gospel of Mark reifies this information into history as coming directly from Jesus, while Paul, an earlier and independent account, doesn't show any kind of indication that he knows that Jesus taught this. If he had any kind of indication that Jesus taught this, then he would have definitely said that the Lord has commanded it, because that right there in the Gospel of Mark was the Lord commanding. All the Gospel of Mark's author did was take what Paul said about paying your taxes and put it into Jesus's mouth in a way that Jesus would have taught for Mark's gospel. This is but one particular piece of evidence, and like I said, the case is cumulative for the Gospel of Mark knowing Paul's work. So I highly suggest everybody reads up on this with the sources that I mentioned before. If you don't want to go through all of those sources, I will have an article linked down below by Richard Carrier that pretty much summarizes the best case put forward by all of the sources mentioned. So definitely go down there and check that out. Other examples of the Gospel of Mark using Paul in order to inform his gospel would concern things like the Last Supper. Another thing is this idea that when we resurrect, we'll be resurrected into these divinely created bodies. And in Mark, Jesus actually directly says that this will happen, while Paul has to struggle to justify this particular theology because it didn't come from Jesus, at least for Paul. Also, the Gospel of Mark is full of various Pauline themes, like equating Jesus' sacrifice to the Passover and the Yom Kippur ritual. Also, Mark reifies Paul's idea of a Torah-free gospel into his gospel. Mark also has Jesus teaching about divorce in the exact same way that Paul does. Another thing is this phrase, Abba Father. Paul uses this phrase and it's a repeated duplicative. And so what Mark does is he just has Jesus saying it. So there's another connection. Although that was a little bit weaker than the others, but still, it's there. Another thing that Mark does is because Paul rebukes Peter, he also has Jesus rebuking Peter. The list goes on and on and on of the connections between the synoptic gospels, namely, the Gospel of Mark with Paul's epistles. So there's definitely a connection there. Now, on to John's gospel. It's quickly becoming the consensus opinion in Johannine studies that the Gospel of John definitely knew the synoptic gospels. This is what L. Michael White has to say about the connection between the Gospel of John and the other gospels. John's many changes to the synoptics may well have been made intentionally and with full awareness of the synoptic tradition. Several features of the Johannine narrative seem to reflect such an awareness and use of the synoptic tradition, including direct verbal similarities with distinctive linguistic formulations or narrative elements in Mark and Luke, respectively. There are several different ways in which we know that the Gospel of John definitely knew at least Luke. One of the more notable connections that we have is the story of Lazarus. Luke has a completely different Lazarus than the Gospel of John. Luke's Lazarus is a parable that's meant to convey the message that no amount of miracles are going to save anybody. So there's really no point in Jesus doing a miracle because that's not going to cause people to believe. While John's Lazarus is a real Lazarus, not a parable, that is resurrected from the dead, and that miracle immediately converts a lot of people to believing in Jesus and praising Him. This is one of the more glaring redactions or corrections that John does, but John also has a lot of other things that he takes from the synoptic gospels and twists or just completely rewrites. Another connection is that the Gospel of John seems to have taken Mark's pairing of both the feeding of the 5,000 and Jesus walking on the water. John uses the exact same sequence as Mark does, which means that he most likely got it from Mark's gospel. And we know this because the pairing of both of those events was a product of Mark's literary structure. There's also several small details that both the Gospel of John and Mark report, and there are so many in the exact same sequence that it's hard to say that the Gospel of John did not know Mark's gospel. If you would like to know more about the connections between the Gospel of John and the other synoptic gospels and how this is becoming a consensus among Johannine studies, I will have a list up here of all of the relevant sources that you can look into if you choose to. And if you get your kicks and giggles from reading scholarly sources like that, then please check them out. But the point is that the Gospel of John definitely knew the synoptics, which, if we go back to the first point that Dadpool made, means that the Gospels, all of the Gospels, are not independent accounts. And there are no other independent accounts external to the Bible. So that leaves us with just Paul's account as being the single independent account that we have about Jesus. So independent sources? No, more like independent source maybe, as far as textual sources go, he is independent of all other texts that we have, so he's independent in that way. But claiming that we definitely have independent sources about Jesus existing in history, that's just not true.
Now, lack of contradictions. This one's a tough one because, holy shit, yeah. There are a lot of contradictions. But they all universally agree that Jesus was a real person and he was crucified by the Romans. So if we're talking about Jesus existing as a historic figure, it gets a blue check. But if we're trying to learn anything else about Jesus, it's going to get an X.
This is quite interesting, the way that he gauges this particular criteria here, because he gives it both a blue check and a red X for different things, but I really think that this just needs to have a big red X put on it in general. Now, while true, all of the gospel accounts have Jesus existing as a historical figure, you can't necessarily say that for Paul's work. So it is a little bit contradictory there. Of course, Captain Dadpool thinks that Paul thought of Jesus as a historically existing person, so he would obviously be perfectly fine with saying that there is no contradiction between the gospel narratives and Paul. One thing that Paul definitely contradicts the gospels on is who crucified Jesus, because Paul never says the Romans did. That particular idea doesn't actually come into the picture until the Gospels are written. They're the ones that blame the Romans for Jesus' death, while Paul blames the archons of this aeon, which archon was used to talk about rulers and the governing people at the time. And that's true, but none of them were called archons of this aeon. That's a very particular title or phrase, and Paul uses similar phrasing when he's referencing Satan and the demons and the powers and principalities of this world. So it seems like Paul was probably talking about Satan and his demons rather than the Romans at that time. This is also a view that's shared by the early church fathers like Origen. He understood Paul to be talking about Satan and his demons killing Jesus and not the Romans. So this is an idea that reaches far back into Christian history. I also find it kind of weird how he puts a red X on this as saying, oh, but we can't use them to know any specific details about Jesus, when I'm fairly certain that he definitely thinks there are some historical facts within the Gospels. I know that Captain Dadpool generally follows Bart Ehrman's line of thinking on this. He believes that things like Jesus coming from Nazareth is a real thing, Pilate crucifying Jesus, and those kind of incidental details are historical facts that are contained within the gospel. So just in general, I disagree with his evaluation of this particular criteria.
Now, are they internally consistent? This would take a lot of time to explain, and I'm running out of time, but the answer is yes and no. So we're going to give it an orange M. Again, for meh.
Well, so obviously the gospels are not exactly internally consistent. As far as Paul goes being internally consistent, I feel like Paul is internally consistent both with himself and the things that he's teaching and the greater landscape of Jewish ideologies that were going around the first century. So while Captain Dadpool would put a meh right here, depending on what he means by internally consistent, which he's kind of being a little vague on it right here, I would have to give this one a blue check, because Paul is internally consistent throughout his epistles about who Jesus was, what he said, what he did, what he didn't say. So it's hard for me to sit here and say that he wasn't internally consistent. And it really just depends on how you interpret Paul whenever he speaks about Jesus' birth or the things that Jesus supposedly did, like the Last Supper, Jesus' crucifixion, and whether or not he was born of a woman. There's also the Brothers of the Lord thing. So it really depends on these very few vague passages in Paul's work and how you interpret them as to what you think Paul is talking about. But the fact is that he remains internally consistent. And the reason why I'm only considering Paul here and not the Gospels, because obviously the Gospels are not internally consistent in various ways. But again, what we visited before, all four Gospels, they ultimately rely on Paul's epistles in order to create their stories about Jesus. So you really only have Paul's epistles. That is the independent account of Jesus. So that's the reason why I'm only considering Paul as far as this internally consistent criteria.
Now, are they non-biased? Hard fucking no. But like I've said before, just because a source is biased, that doesn't mean you automatically throw it out entirely. That just means you look at it more carefully to find what in it is biased and what is disinterested. Or neutral is another word you can use.
Well, it's not just about what's biased and what's disinterested. I think that you have to carefully analyze what Paul is saying, how he is saying it, and how Paul uses certain words like, genomai and genao, and then adelphos, Paul's whole theology on the family of God. Like what is, in order to understand what brother of the Lord could mean, you have to understand what Paul means when he talks about the family of God. And what Paul means with the family of God is that everybody's part of the family of God, and so everybody is therefore a brother or sister of Jesus. So it makes it really hard to discern whether or not Paul thought that Jesus had a brother. I think that the overwhelming evidence suggests that Paul didn't think of anybody as a blood relative of Jesus, but just of this fictive kinship that every Christian, every baptized Christian has with Jesus. It's that kind of scrutiny that we're talking about when we're talking about these biased sources and needing to look at them a bit closer and analyze them. Not just about what is biased and what is neutral, but what did Paul actually mean when he says the things that he's saying? That's what we have to actually judge.
So this is how we're looking. Again, for someone who lived 2,000 years ago, especially for someone who did not write anything down himself, this is why Bart Ehrman says that the issue of Jesus existing as a historic figure is not even an issue among historians, because his existence passes their criteria with flying colors.
Now, flying colors? Jesus does not pass the normal historian's criteria for existing in history with flying colors, unless you mean a mixed bag of blue and red X's. And I mean, even then, I don't think the blue check marks really outweigh the red check marks in that. I mean, obviously, I disagree with a number of Captain Dadpool's evaluation of the criteria here. Like, obviously, I disagree with him, but even on his own summary of the criteria, it's not passing with flying colors as far as good evidence that Jesus definitely existed. Also, I want to touch on this whole idea that historians consider Jesus to be a historical person, because that right there is a very complicated phrase to put. For one thing, Bart Ehrman regularly switches up between New Testament scholars and historians. He probably considers both groups to be the same thing, but they're really not. So when you think about historians, and when you talk about historians, we're thinking about the entire field of history. But the problem is that if anybody knows Dr. Josh is an Assyriologist. He would be a historian about Assyrian history and everything of that nature. That's his area of expertise. Now, if you start trying to talk to Dr. Josh about New Testament stuff or anything, even World War II, he's going to tell you that this is out of my area of expertise. And so the only thing that he can really do is just tell you what the consensus scholarship is. And that's essentially what Bart Ehrman does. Bart Ehrman just regurgitates the consensus opinions of New Testament scholars. And that's what you would find with other historians in different fields that are not directly concerned with New Testament studies. They would go with what the consensus says. And currently the consensus is controlled by New Testament scholars, most of whom are controlled by either statements of faith or a dogmatic adherence to their belief. And so that results in this narrative of, most New Testament scholars or most historians don't even entertain the idea that Jesus didn't exist. That's either because of these statements of faith, or they don't want to be blacklisted from the rest of the community and essentially have no way to make a living using their degree. This has happened to multiple people in the past. So simply saying that all historians agree that Jesus existed and it's because of this historical criteria that they think this, that's not exactly a real representation of the situation. New Testament scholars don't even consider the question of whether or not Jesus existed in history because of all of the problems that I had just listed. So there's no real merit in that particular phrase. In fact, I would say that it's both a argument from authority, but also an argument from false authority, if you're including all historians in that particular state. The argument from authority would come from the idea that, New Testament scholars all agree that Jesus existed in history, so therefore he did. That's an argument from authority. Now, could they have good evidence to say that? Sure, but that's not why we should consider Jesus to have existed in history. We should consider him to have existed because the evidence suggests it, not because New Testament scholars all agree that he did. And then there's the argument from false authority. That would come from using historians that are outside of their area of expertise in order to corroborate what the New Testament scholars are telling people. The historians outside of the field would just use the consensus of the field, which, again, like I said, is controlled by the New Testament scholars. Basically, what I'm saying is that the field of New Testament studies is broken, and I don't think that it's going to get fixed anytime soon, especially not with rhetoric like all historians agree that Jesus existed.
Now, anything else regarding the details of his life or the miracle claims made about him? Yeah, hard no. So yeah, hope that helped.
This is kind of weird because, again, just like before, Captain Dadpool seems to think that we can't know any details of Jesus' life, which, I mean, I would agree. If Jesus was a historical figure, then I don't think that we can know anything about, his historical existence. But at the same time, typically what a historicist thinks, or the historicist position, is that we do know some historical facts about Jesus' life, like where he's from, Nazareth, the fact that he pissed off the Romans and that the Romans crucified him, the fact that he had a following, a cult following. Like, these are things that are established by the gospel narratives. And so you have to at least agree that there are some historical facts in the gospels. But I keep getting this mixed message from Captain Dadpool here. But anyways, that's it for Captain Dadpool's video. Again, I had a little bit more disagreement with his evaluation than I did with, his list of criteria. I mostly thought that his criteria list was perfectly fine. I didn't see the value in like the consistency criteria, but I think that it's okay that he had it in there. So really the only problems that I had with Captain Dadpool's methodology here was just how he evaluated those criteria against the historical Jesus. Everything that I have put forward in this video as far as my position goes is backed by scholarship, and the idea that the gospel narratives, like all of the gospels, are based off of Paul's work is quickly becoming the consensus in the field. So it seems to me like when you evaluate the criteria that was laid out in this video with the most current scholarship that we have, you're going to find that the case for Jesus existing is really not as rock solid as a lot of people make it out to be. Thank you, heathens, for joining me today. I really appreciate you guys listening to what I had to say about Captain Dadpool's criteria list here. If you will, please go down below and let me know what your thoughts are about what I've laid out here, what Dadpool has laid out. I'd really love to hear, or rather read, what you guys think. So let me know down below. And hey, while you're down there, why don't you smash that like button and subscribe if you like this kind of content. Don't forget to stand up and use your voice. Bye, heathens.